in chapter 2, you speak about the past being prologue in creation in the Exodus. And that's an interesting thing to think about, how the creation account in Genesis can serve as a prologue to the Exodus motif. How does that function?
Yeah, a couple thoughts come to mind, Camden. I think what I tried to show is you have some of the imagery there that's going to be worked. So you have the tree imagery, the mountain motif. We know from subsequent scripture and then also from the ancient Near Eastern context that this garden space is also portrayed as a mountain. Mm-hmm. And so you have those things playing, which will subsequently be repeated or at least alluded to. Perhaps even more important, you have the notion of eschatological advancement. In other words, Adam and Eve were created in relative perfection. They had not reached their highest estate yet. Yeah. Where had they succeeded in their probation, they would have ascended to a place where they would no longer be able to sin. Mm-hmm. And so that sets you up for this further subsequent advancement at each stage in redemptive history. Last week in class, I'd never used this illustration, but I had a couple of ex-baseball players in class, so I started using the illustration of one of those pitching machines. Probably almost everybody has seen, where you have the great big white tire wheel and somebody feeds a ball into there and it kicks the ball out very quickly for people to do batting practice. Scripture's kind of like that in various stages. So, we get up to Exodus book and the Sinai scene, and suddenly you're propelled forward, and the Psalms do the same thing, and Isaiah does the same thing, Jeremiah, etc. And even the New Testament gospel writers do the same thing, constantly pushing us towards that advancement, that eschatological advancement. And so that's one of the major themes that is there and revisited. And then also building off the important work of Michael Morales on garden temple themes. He's always talking about a descender or an ascender. You get this constant motif of the tabernacle and the temple and barriers to enter into that. Mm-hmm. And so we see there's constantly one who's called to be a leader and lead in his train people through a barrier to the mountain or the temple in order to worship God. And the question that often begs the question, the narrative, will they succeed? And so that theme is constantly brought up.
Well, it's tremendous. You think about the mountain theme, something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Our colleague Lane Tipton just taught a course on Foundations of Covenant Theology. He's really developing a lot of Klein's themes on that, and how that mountain garden temple is so significant that Adam was called to ascend the mountain of the Lord. Now we see Christ doing that. So that adds great dimension to the Exodus motif, because we're being called out of slavery, out of our death to sin, and being led somewhere into the promised land. But we shouldn't think of the end or the terminus of the Exodus going back to Eden. Exactly. It's the new heavens and new earth, ultimately.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
So how do we see some of that in the Psalms? You spend an enormous amount of time in the Psalms of late, and we're thankful for that. But we see the Exodus motif prevalent there too, don't we?
Yeah, it's all over the place. This book could have been much longer, but they were constantly reeling me in, and so I had to choose certain Psalms to discuss and talk about. But there are other Psalms that aren't even talked about in there where the Exodus is very prominent. So I think this gets back, perhaps the best thing for your listeners will be to talk about how this motif is re-actualized in the Psalms. And so we constantly see when various authors in the Psalter are alluding to the Exodus, they're often doing that for either the conviction of their present audience or for their encouragement or both. And so they will appeal to Exodus themes and and then they'll use that with its exhortation, sermonic value, if you will, or import for their present audience. Let me give you a couple examples that come to mind. I already referred to Psalm 118. Psalm 77 is beautiful. You have an individual lamenter who we're not exactly sure who he was or what his angst was all about, but he's crying out to the Lord for deliverance and freedom from his oppression and his whatever the vicissitudes were that he was wrestling with. And then in the latter part of the psalm, he begins to, it's early in the psalm too, but it's more explicit in the latter part of the psalm. And then he begins to appealing to God, do like you did earlier in the Exodus. There's a very subtle play early in the psalm, I forget what verse, 3 or 4, and he's referring to, as in the Shinot, the years of the Lord, you were active, and he's referring obviously back to the Exodus generation. And then he gets up to like verses 5 or 6, and he goes, no, further than that, 7 or 8, and he asks a question, the right arm of the Lord has changed, because the same word Shinot, which was used earlier for years, can also in Hebrew be from Shana, to change. And so he's asking the question, has the right arm of the Lord changed? In other words, the psalmist knows that God can deliver, but he's not acting. Mm-hmm. And so he's crying out, oh Lord, has your right arm changed, or are you still concerned to vindicate me with your right arm, which is all Exodus kind of theme language. And then, as often happens in the Psalms, he draws great courage towards the end of the Psalm by recognizing that God has not changed. And you have what's called the dry shod theme or motif. In other words, even as you pass through the waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Well, this isn't kind of the schmaltzy poster, about that we've probably all seen it hanging up in bathrooms, with the footprints in the sand kind of thing. But in a sense, it kind of is that in a still small faith, but nevertheless robust, he's saying, well, just like of old you destroyed our enemies, so too you can deliver us now. And even though we looked out on the desecration of all our enemies, and yet the hot east wind was gone, if you will, so too you can deliver us now, even as Moses and Aaron led the people. And so that's what I mean by reactualization. So here's the psalmist alluding back to the Exodus event and saying, you can draw courage from this for your present sufferings and your present pilgrimage.